Lovely to see you all. A big full house this evening, and a great topic, some great wines. As we know, there's a few people who haven't been on before. We like to keep this pretty casual and also as quick as possible to charge through these wines. I will try and keep this to the hour. We're already 4 minutes in. I know people have dinner and homes to get back to. Well, you're still in your homes, I assume. But what I would encourage people to do is to use the chat function vociferously throughout if you've got any comments or questions. However, although we're quite a large group tonight, if you do have longer questions, more technical questions that might possibly wait until the end, then perhaps you'd be kind enough to not overly interrupt the flow. However, if you've got sort of some brief comments or burning questions you have to ask, then we do like to keep these as interactive as possible. So please do feel free to unmute yourself and ask away or comment away. We've got a few members of the Honest Grapes team on this evening who will also be entering things into the chat function with regards to what wine we're drinking, vintage availability, other bits and pieces. So do follow that chat as well. Great. Right. Without further ado, let's launch into wine number one, the Romitorio 2015. That is your wine number one. And whilst you're just enjoying that and savoring that, I will introduce you to Montalcino, to the region, and because it's a fascinating region, and it's one that's very dear to my heart. I get asked a lot, what is my favorite wine? And there are a number of answers depending on who's asking and what winemaker I'm hosting or is hosting me at lunch, frankly. But I can't deny my love of Brunello. I was for a time living in Florence years ago, and I think that massively underpinned my appreciation of the wines of Montalcino. There are wonderful wines, as we know, from all around the world. I think that in terms of pure unalloyed pleasure, I can't think of a region which tops Montalcino for me so consistently. We've all had disappointing Bordeaux and Burgundy and other wines from, heralded regions. It's pretty unusual for me to have a disappointing Brunello. And there have been a string of great vintages, but there have also been some indifferent vintages. We are, I can honestly say this evening, only drinking 4- and 5-star vintages, but it would actually be a fascinating tasting to drink the less heralded vintages, the 14s, the 02s, maybe 08, which is still a 3-star vintage and rather pleasant, because I think even in lesser vintages, which by and large tend to be either too hot or too wet, you still get really interesting wines. Maybe we'll do that as another tasting, the off vintage Brunello tasting. Probably have about half the numbers, but still worth doing. History of Brunello really kicked off in the 1800s after the Risorgimento, when Clemente Santi, who was fighting with Giuseppe Garibaldi, returned home to Tuscany and was determined to take the local grape, the Sangiovese grape, the particular clone of Sangiovese, in fact, Sangiovese Grosso, or fat Sangiovese, not because it's a large grape, quite the reverse. It's actually quite a small berry, but it has a thick skin, and it's from the skins that we derive the tannins and the color, which is why Brunello tends to be the richest, darkest, and also most long-lived of the Sangiovese-based wines of Tuscany. Anyway, not at the time. Sangiovese was very, well, it was held in relatively poor regard, so much so that until relatively recently, i.e. the 70s, you couldn't make Chianti up the road, a bit further north, with 100% Sangiovese. You had to blend it with other local grapes because it wasn't considered sufficiently noble variety to carry the weight of an entire wine on its own. Anyway, Clemente thought he knew better, and he was determined to bring Sangiovese into the light. And so he started planting, he started producing wines. he laid the groundwork, if you like, for this original work. And it was his grandson, Ferruccio Biondi Santi. Now probably bells are going off. This is a name that you're probably familiar with. Launched the first Brunello in 1888. And he put in place the foundations for the wine that we know today. Now, there have been a lot of evolutions since then. And for those of you who joined us when we were lucky enough to have Filippo Chia from Romitorio with us last week to focus in on his Brunellos, you'll know his thoughts on just how good Brunello has got in the last decade by comparison to where it was. However, we can say that Brunello begins with Biondi Santi, and it is to this family really that we owe the tremendous debt of having the wines that we enjoy today. Now, after this period, Brunello sort of rapidly advanced itself, shall we say. In the 1960s, they were just 11 growers. The original consortio, founded in 1967, had 11 original growers, of which we have 2 represented here this evening. And we'll speak about who those are anon. If anyone wants to guess and put that in the chat function, there'll be no prize, but we'll know who the geeks are. So feel free to comment. And obviously, Brunello quite rapidly established itself as a wine of great quality and put Montalcino on the map, because in 1968 it was one of the first, well, it was amongst the first Italian fine wines to be given the DOCG, Denominazione Origine Controllata Garantita designation. So it was the first Italian red wine to be, so the first amongst equals, if you like. It was the first wine to be considered truly top of the tree. We'll pause now in the history of Brunello so you can enjoy what's in your glass, and we will flash forward to almost but not quite the present day, because we're starting with the previously released vintage of Brunello, the 2015 from Romitorio. So if everyone wants to make sure they've got that, have a good nose, have a good taste. 2015 was the vintage that we've all been waiting for. The not quite but almost new 2010. And what's fascinating is that had it not been for 2016, and we'll be trying the Argiano 2016 in 3 wines time, then I think 2015 would be heralded as the greatest vintage of the last decade. Certainly, it's the best since 2010, and perhaps we'll unpack the vintages in a little more depth a little bit later on, because I know you're all thirsty. But with regard to 2015, it is a vintage which I wouldn't say, it definitely doesn't split opinion. Everyone thinks it's good, but what is quite interesting is how certain critics rate it the equal of, or even better than 2016. But I would say the majority tend to put 15 ever so slightly below 16. Now, 15 was a solar vintage. I think the comparison, for those who are unfamiliar with Montalcino, between 15 and 16 is rather similar to Bordeaux, in fact. So those who are more familiar with Bordeaux and Bordeaux vintages, I think it would be reasonably fair to make a similar comparison between the 2 vintages. There's no denying both are gorgeous, but 16 has potentially a freshness, has a purity and a focus, whereas 15 has a voluptuousness, a richness, a ripeness. And perhaps that's why some critics, most notably among them James Suckling, who is probably the most experienced Brunello critic. He's been tasting right back since the early 80s. So I think you have to give him, a pretty fair amount of credence. He believes that the 15 vintage is the perfect Brunello. He thinks it's pretty much the best vintage there's ever been. And it was certainly gorgeous. You know, it is gorgeous. I mean, even now, very, very youthful. This is you know, only 1 year from release. Bearing in mind we are currently releasing the 2016 vintage. It's a baby. And to stave off the inevitable questions about drinking windows, Brunello, to my mind, is best drunk 7 years from the vintage, 7 to 15 years, with exceptional vintages being 20-year plus wines. We will be planning, I suppose I can mention this, we have some bottles of 1945 and 1964 Biondi Santi Brunello, which we intend to include in some incredibly swanky dinners when we're allowed to do them. And I think that represents the absolute peak of Brunello drinking. So watch this space. But typically I would say 7 to 15 year drinking window is spot on. So the 15, we're not there yet. It's young, but it's very, very good. And I think, I hope you can taste and smell the ripe and warm and rich nature of the vintage. It's clearly a warm year. It would be interesting, if not especially edifying, to have the 2014 next to it. But Romitorio didn't make it 2014. In fact, very few top growers did make a 14, because 14 was a very, very tough vintage indeed. It was very wet and it was very cold. 15 quite the reverse. On to Romitorio itself. Romitorio is an amazing estate. I know there's a number of people on the call this evening who were with us last week and had the great delight of hearing Filippo tell his family's story himself. I'll have to do it much more briefly, and no, certainly not as eloquently, but fascinating story. Romitorio is in the northwest of Montalcino, and we'll discuss as we go a little bit more about the different zones or regions, sub-regions within Montalcino. But effectively, Romitorio is northerly and reasonably high up, so sort of 200 to 400 meters, depending on the vineyards, with soil which is a combination of real kind of fossil maritime soils, this galestro soil and clay, a real mix of soils. But the key thing about the wine, and or I should say the key thing about the area here to the north of Montalcino, is the freshness. There is wonderful freshness. So in a vintage like 15, a vintage like 2007, which Filippo was at pains to point out is drinking superbly right now. If you want the perfect Brunello vintage for now, it's the 07, where they're very hot, forward, ripe vintages, these cooler terroirs do exceptionally well. So Romitorio, founded in 1984, when Sandro Chia, the famous leader of the Italian Transavanguardia modern art movement, swapped this ancient castle, which dated right back to the Roman times, with a well-known art patron, Count Franchetti, Barone Franchetti, for 5 of his paintings. 5 of his paintings. So that gives you a measure of either how run down the castle was or what an esteemed artist he was. It's the latter, in case you weren't aware, but you can look him up. And Sandro took a huge interest in making wine, still paints. It has his studio in the castle, and the labels of the bottles are effectively his paintings. So they're artworks in and of themselves. Sandro's son, Filippo, together with the son of the original winemaker, Stefano Martini. So it's Stefano and Filippo, who are now owner and winemaker respectively, have taken on the running of the estate. And I think they're doing incredible things. An interesting comment here was from Monica Lana, who said, of the Wine Advocate, who said 2015 would please a lot of palates, but where some estates struggle to find a sense of place, Romitorio excelled. And I think that's what you find with Romitorio always, is a wonderful sense of terroir-driven wines. You know, there is a great sense of place with Romitorio. It's not just Brunello, it's very much Romitorio. Now, sorry, I'm conscious we're only one wine down, and I've taken best part of 15 minutes. So I will charge on. There's an awful lot I could say about each estate, and I will stay on at the end to answer the inevitable questions I've completely failed to cover. So apologies for racing through, but we do have more wines to come on to. And wine number 2 is the Poggiarelli Cortonesi 2013, or I should say, sorry, Cortonesi's Poggiarelli 2013. And whilst you're trying that and smelling that and having a taste, having a nose, we'll just get back to the history of Brunello, because we were sort of doing quite well. Well, we were up to getting the DOCG in '68, so we weren't doing that well. But well, by the turn of the century, from the 11 original producers, there were over 200. I think it's 211, possibly 215 producers. Someone in the Honest Grapes team can do a quick Google and either post it for everyone or send it to me discreetly, and I can pretend I remembered it and had actually done my homework. But yeah, it's a little over 200 estates now. So quite a significant development for a region in a fairly short space of time. And then in terms of the production, I suppose, what are the important things to remember and what characterizes the style and the quality of the wine. Firstly, a Brunello has to spend 5 years prior to release, of which 2 of which must be in oak. So that's quite interesting. You don't have to spend all of your period in the cellar in oak, and you are starting to see a couple of producers, especially in the lighter vintages, like 2008, for example, vintages like 2014, where not much choice, where it sort of behoves you to take the wine out of oak earlier to preserve freshness. So this means you bottle it a bit earlier before releasing it. So it still has to be aged for the same amount of time, but you don't have to keep it in tonneau, the big oak tonneau, or barriques if you're using some barriques. 2013. 2013 is a great vintage. Again, it's possibly, opinion is ever so slightly split. And it does tend to be split on slightly transatlantic lines, dare I say it. One tends to see certain American critics, certainly the Wine Spectator, for example, rating the previous 2012 vintage ahead of 2013, whereas 2013, I suppose, for a number of other critics, is slightly prettier. It has a bit more charm and a bit more balance. That's not to say that 2012 isn't a great vintage and delicious and just starting to drink now. I think James Suckling called it the rock star vintage. It's a very, possibly 2012 and 2013, gosh, you could say are a previous 2015, 2016, but I think that's probably doing 2015 slightly unfairly by comparing it to 2012. But anyway, point is, 2013 has great style, a degree of finesse, particularly from a producer like Romitorio. It was a later ripening vintage, which meant an awful lot of the action happened towards the end of the growing season, when you got a very a later, hot, dry end of the growing season into the harvest. It was fortunate, therefore, that there had been a decent amount of scattered rains around the region beforehand, so you didn't get too much of the baked character that you got in 2011. So anyway, sorry, here we are with our Cortonesi. So Cortonesi, another fairly young estate. We're starting with 2 of the more recent additions to the Montalcino canon. The Cortonesi family had been making wine since the 70s, but it was only in 85, so a year after the foundation of Castello di Romitorio, that they started selling their wines commercially. And Tommaso, who's the 3rd generation, which is his grandfather who bought the estate, is now running the show. It's sort of 8 hectares, and we're a little bit further south than Romitorio. We're by, well, technically speaking, the wine you're drinking isn't, but the farm itself, which is called La Manella, is. This particular vineyard is right down in the southeast. It's southeast in Castelnuovo dell'Abate, and that's why it's going to make a very interesting comparison to the Mastrojanni 13 that follows, because they're from actually a very similar area, but they're quite different wines. So it's a very small production, the wine you're drinking now. They only make 4,000 bottles, and we are in. It's not quite as warm a vintage as 15, but still pretty warm. And yet we are now, as I said, down in the south of Montalcino, and the difference, interesting from Gareth there. Yeah, the difference I was about to say, and I think your tasting clearly for you, Gareth, has borne this out, is there's an incredible richness and concentration to the wine. Now, this is not vintage dependent. This is very much region or sub-region dependent. It can be 3 or 4 or 5 or even more degrees hotter here in the south than it is necessarily in the north. So I'm just seeing Raj's comment there. Cortonesi presents more herbaceous and it's gone. Sorry, it was there. It was on the chat. Something about the amount of desteming. It's 100% destemmed as far as I'm aware. Raj or Paddy, I'm not sure who asked that question, but yeah, it's 100% destemmed Cortonesi. They're not you don't tend to see an awful lot of whole bunch at the moment. I think we will start to see some experimentation with that, but it's still a bit of a rarity, I'd say, in Montalcino generally. The Poggiarelli is, I suppose, a slightly more modern style in that it's 50% new oak and 50% second year, in fact. So yeah, you're getting a slightly more modern style, a definite late harvest, ripe, very rich, quite powerful. I would say shows more of the character of the vineyard than it does of the vintage, shall we say. Now let's just have a look. Okay, good. So comparing with the Mastrojanni, I'll be very interested. If you've got a little bit left of the Cortonesi, then perhaps keep it, and because we're doing a direct comparison with another 2013 Castelnuovo dell'Abate wine, amber. The ABV of these wines is 14 to 14 and a half. Brunello only rarely dips below, and well, very rarely is labeled as being above, shall we say. Just as I'm conscious we're charging on, in case there's a few important things I've missed, let's just return to the grape itself. I mentioned it was Sangiovese Grosso, this particular clone of Sangiovese with the thick skin and the small berry, very concentrated. It therefore does cope pretty well with the sort of heat that we see in a vintage like 15 or later harvests as we see in the Cortonesi 2013. It's a pretty robust version of Sangiovese, and therefore I think it makes wines which are naturally at once hedonistic but have good structure as well. This is, this definitely has tannins, and you'll probably see the tannins more now with the Mastrojanni than you might have seen with the any relation to Marcello? No, sadly not. Although if you Google this afterwards, before the Illy family of coffee fame bought the estate, gosh, when was that? 10 years ago or so. And changed the labels, and the labels have become all terribly sort of smart and got a seal on it, some nice nice writing. They had the most fabulous sort of 1970s disco labels. It's absolutely brilliant. If you look them up, they're just crazy. And I think the last vintage before they changed was 2003. I think I have some 2003. Not the greatest vintage for Mastrojanni, a bit too hot, frankly, for them. But amazing labels. If you want to look them up afterwards, you'll see they were fabulous, sort of funky 70s disco label, which I think Marcello Mastrojanni would have massively approved of. But no, so we're still in Castelnuovo dell'Abate, just literally by the village itself, in the southeast. And you go down this little dirt track and you come to the estate. And I think the huge investment that the Illy family have put in is really paying off. They have also done something which I think is a good idea, that they have, Mastrojanni feels like it needs more time. Yes, yes, I totally agree. That Cortonesi is incredibly there. It's all there right now, isn't it? Whereas the Mastrojanni seems slightly more tightly coiled. There's perhaps better tension in the wine. I think they're very conscious of how hot it gets there. I remember being there in 2011 in the vineyards, and the ivory or the mercury was sort of tipping nearly 50 degrees. It was insanely hot. It was absolutely insanely hot. 2011 as a vintage, by the way, is a great restaurant vintage, but anything you've got in your cellar now, you can comfortably, tackle. It's so ripe and so big and so rich. And I think Mastrojanni have learned over the years that they do have a very ripe terroir. They have a terroir which ripens early, which has a lot of heat. Therefore, I think they are mitigating that by picking a little bit earlier, ensuring the freshness, ensuring nice kind of tannic structure. And the thing I was about to mention was that whilst they still use new oak, and I think they've no longer got any of their barriques. So they're using new oak, but they're using big new oak. So 500-litre oak rather than 250. And I think that gives the wine a bit more of a chance to age. There's a touch more of an oxidative effect on the wine. All in all, it preserves some of the freshness. You don't clamp it down with new oak like an awful lot of wine regions have suffered from, I suppose, in the decade past. Now seems like a perfect opportunity to ask people, whether it's by a show of hands or a enthusiastic or otherwise comment, if we're comparing the two 13s, like with like, hands up, or put in the chat. Let's do hands up, it's easier. Who preferred the Cortonesi, the Poggiarelli, so the first of that pair? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm just got a 6. So Frank 7. Hang on, I've got 2 pages here on Zoom, so I'm going 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, no, hang on, that's a small child. That doesn't count. Okay, that was both hands in the air. Right. So 12. Okay, right. So and there are more options than one or the other. I hated both of them or I like them equally. So let's just play this out. Who preferred the Mastrojanni 13? Hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay. And hands up who either liked them equally or didn't particularly like either of them. Actually, I suppose that's a bit harsh, because if you put your hand up, you might assume I think you didn't like either of them, in which case I'll be horribly offended and never let you come to another tasting again. So sorry, let's scrap that, whatever. Okay, so it wasn't quite equal. There was clearly a preference, not a huge one, but a preference for the Mastrojanni. I would say, and you can't say this with these little 50 ml samples that we have this evening, but these are sufficiently youthful. 13 is about the youngest Brunello vintage I would tackle right now, and if you had these in bottles, these will taste far better the following day and even the day after. So to my earlier point about the drinking window for Brunello, don't like to be too didactic about these things and say you mustn't touch it for this number of years or you must drink by then. I think Brunello is a bit more embracing and less challenging than some wines, but I would say this is definitely in its first flush of youth. However, its first flush of youth for Brunello. The wonderful thing about Brunello, even more so than Barolo, because whatever way you cut it, a newly released vintage of Barolo is not an immediate drinker, I'm afraid, however forward the vintage. Whereas Brunello spent 5 years aging before it comes to the market. So, it's not like drinking a 2018 Bordeaux, for example, which have very recently been shipped or are being shipped, ex-estate now. Well, by the time they hit these shores, they're actually on the way to drinking. Of course, by the time they hit these shores these days, they'll have been held up for 2 years by the new Brexit paperwork. So actually, they'll be even more ready to drink. So again, the joys of Brexit, just brilliant. So anyway, so yeah, we won't go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, I do think that's one of the nice things for you as consumers when it comes to tasting Brunellos is unless you're out at the estate, and I saw Wendy and David's comment earlier, I know they were out there the other year, you will drink a wine from bottle which is 5 years old. And I think it gives you, therefore, hopefully greater confidence that you will enjoy that wine. Even if it's youthful, you're not drinking something which is far too young to drink. You're just drinking something which is a year or two off its early drinking window. Okay, 3 more wines to go. So let's go on to the first of our old wines, old wineries, I should say, old wineries. In fact, this is the latest vintage. So we're doing the latest release from one of the original 11 estates in Montalcino, who was part of the Consorzio in 1967. This is Argiano, very ancient, noble estate, dates back till 1580 in the Pecci family of Siena. It's a bloody beautiful castle. I mean, it's picture postcard perfect when you go visit. Absolutely gorgeous. It's in Sant'Angelo in Colle and Tavernelle, between the two. So we're almost as far south as the previous 2 wines were from, but we are further east, and I beg your pardon, sorry, further west. And so you've got a slightly different soil here. There's an interesting mix of that Galestro soil that you see further north, a bit of clay as well, which is quite helpful because it's still hot here, but the water retention once again keeps the freshness. Argiano is sizable. It's got 70 hectares. So if you consider that the Cortonesi only had 8 hectares in total, this is a big estate. I would say that the main points of interest with regards to the history, and we could cover off who fought over it and which family had it for this period of time. But with the Contessa Cinzano, of Cinzano fame, one has to assume, she brought with her in 1992, when she took on the estate, Giacomo Takis. So Giacomo, who some of you will have definitely heard me reference before in tastings about Tuscany, in San Leonardo tastings, just the other week, in fact, as well. You will know he is one of the great figures in Italian viticulture, enology, I should say. He's a consultant enologist, sadly passed away now, but was one of the absolute giants of enology, and he was brought on as a consultant, and I think did good things to the wine, unquestionably. Probably will be best remembered for introducing Solengo, which is the estate Super Tuscan, which is sort of a Cabernet Petit Verdot blend with other bits and pieces thrown in, and is very well regarded and extremely good value by comparison to some of the Super Tuscans around. Anyway, so Giacomo came in, did his thing, and then I personally think that from the 2015 vintage onwards, when Bernardo Sani came on board and is now the full-time winemaker from 15 onwards, I think Argiano is now jumped into a new league. It still remains one of the best value Brunellos that I've ever tried. I religiously take cases every year, but now I try and take 2 because they remain amazing value. But the critical appreciation for Argiano from the 15 vintage and now into the 16 vintage is considerable. You know, it's across the board a winner. If we turn to the vintage now, specifically 16, it's an incredible vintage. It's a vintage which, if Brunello wasn't on your map, must put it on your map. It's a vintage which, sadly or otherwise, is also going to start to see the wines of Montalcino appear in the portfolios of speculators and those who are buying wine for investment. Not, of course, that's a bad thing, so long as there's enough left for those of us who want to drink it. But it's such a good vintage, rather like Barolo 16, released last year and the year before, in fact. You know, it's actually universally recognized as offering extraordinarily fine wine at an extraordinarily good price. So why is 16 so lauded and heralded? I think the best answer to that question is the answers that were given by a number of producers, certainly growers that I've spoken to, wine estates that you can read about, who've been quoted in various articles. Quite simply, the majority of them said, if you had to write down on January the 1st, you know, how would I like the weather to be this year? You know, what would make a perfect vintage? Then all of them said by the time of harvest, it would be hard to look back and suggest anything they would have changed. You know, it was just a really good extended growing season with, as it turned out, just enough rain. There was a slight concern that there might be a bit too much, but it wasn't. So you had an incredibly extended, long hang time for the grapes. They were all picked at perfect physiological ripeness, no over-ripeness, but no under-ripeness. You know, it was just perfect grapes. And stylistically, the suggestion of the overall character of the vintage is one of great purity and focus and finesse, power. There's a great comment. I haven't written it down. Apologies, but it was Eric Guido writing for Venus said something on the lines of it was like a prancing black stallion or something like that. You know, it was, you know, clearly sort of athletic, muscular. Gorgeous, sleek, racy, you know, everything one could want from a great Brunello. A few other sort of comments from the critical press was that with regards to 2015, the 16s reveal an extra level of depth, tension, and focused intensity. And interestingly, Monica goes on to comment that 2016s have steeper highs and lows compared to the more even-keeled 2015s, but the payback in terms of power and elegance is greater in the 16s overall. Now, I wouldn't actually say that is a view which is universally held. I think I've personally tried more 16s that have all been great than 15s, where some have been a little overwrought, frankly. And I would say as well, you know, that there is a sense that of a consistency in 16. You will see, if you compare critical reviews of the vintage, you will see 16s across the board, not just from the great producers, the incredibly well-known producers, but even less well-known producers, less well-known estates getting very, very commendable scores into the sort of mid-90s. So, you know, I think 16 is a fantastic vintage. We're not trying a 15 Reserva this evening, but that maybe we'll add that into another tasting, because I think as well as the 16s which are being released currently onto the market, 15 Reservas are also being released, and they're more expensive. And are they better than the 16s? Well, it's an interesting point of view. They are different in style. You know, they are flashier, they are fleshier, they are richer. The best 15 Reservas you will definitely want to have in your cellars, and they will probably drink slightly ahead of the 16 estate wines. I'll certainly drink ahead of the 16 Reservas. But you know, if you like your wines with more flesh, more hedonism, more sort of unbridled pleasure, and frankly, who doesn't, then, you know, 15 Reservas should also be on your radar. However, 16 is setting a new benchmark for Montalcino, and you would also want that in your cellar as well. So load up with Brunello is the answer. Oh, interesting thing to point out. Haven't talked much about the viticulture of the vineyards of the estates, but one of the other good things about Argiano is they've been organic now. They started conversion in 2013 with the new owner, Andre Estevez, who's Brazilian, took over. And just 2019, they became the first vineyard, first estate in Montalcino to become entirely plastic free. So obviously, as Honest Grapes, as Green Retailer of the Year, this is something that we're very pleased to be supporting an estate who similarly takes its sort of sustainability credentials seriously. So great wine, incredibly good value. I'm pretty sure we've got a case or two left. If we don't, then I'll take them. But really lovely benchmark Brunello at a sensible price. Now we're getting on to, well, amazing Brunellos, perhaps less sensible prices, sadly, but there we go. And we're returning from the sort of mid-south at Sant'Angelo in Colle. We're now heading back north, really quite far north, almost to the gateway of Montalcino, in fact, with Valdicava. Where to start with Valdicava? Valdicava was a Damascene moment for me. It was one of an early wine tour. I was not even a wine tour, an early, bimble around the vineyards that I was on 15 odd years ago, I think. And I met Vincenzo Abruzzese. I'd been, I'd driven down from Siena, and I was told it was one of the first estates that you'll come to as you drive into the region. And I remember seeing on my left a fairly sort of big, smart building with sort of yellow glass, and thinking, gosh, that must be it, very funky. And turning in there, no, that was actually a consortio building. And on the right was a fairly, I won't say run down, that's unfair, but a nondescript sort of farm. And much like those of you who travel around Bordeaux and Saint-Emilion and will remember the old building of Le Pin, for example, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Very, very sort of nondescript. Went in, met by the charming thank you, Nathan. Yeah, the charming Vincenzo Abruzzese, whose grandfather had been, again, a member of the original consortio back in the 60s. And it was one of the first vineyards I'd been in where, they weren't plowed. There was just grass everywhere, and not just grass, but plants and weeds, frankly, and birds and stuff. And, I remember being a little bit taken aback. And it was an early conversation with Vincenzo about the importance of biodynamics, organic viticulture, or effectively sustainability, biodiversity, and the importance of this for vine health and vine longevity, which I think really opened my eyes to this growing movement in the wine world. So, Valdicava, fascinating wine, fascinating winery, fascinating individual behind it. Yes, okay, Robert Parker said it was in the top 3 wineries in the region. James Suckling has regularly given vintages 100 points. I don't think there's an Italian wine he's given more 100 points to, in fact, including the single vineyard Montosoli 2015, of which we have a few magnums, and the 16 Madonna del Piano, which we'll talk about a bit more when we come on to the Reserva. But anyway, so it's a very critically rated winery, which makes amazing wines. But for me, the thing with Valdicava, and we're right below Romitorio here. We're right below Romitorio. Literally, Filippo says he can kind of, lob rocks down at Vincenzo when he's in the vineyards. And a touch more clay in the soil. Obviously, it's lower down. So we are far north, but it's not quite as cool, I would say, a vineyard as you get at Romitorio. But still, there's a wonderful energy and vivacity to these wines, even in a very ripe vintage like 2007. 2007 for me right now is the perfect Brunello vintage to drink. It's more supple and attractive and charming than the '06, which is going to outlive it. It's certainly more balanced than '05. It's got a little bit more florality and panache than the '04. '04 is a great vintage, but again, it's quite structured and quite sort of. I'd probably leave the '04s for another couple of years. '08 is a vintage in Brunello, which I think is underrated, but I don't tend to go to Montalcino for cool fruit and it's oh god, I was about to say it's like a Chianti in Montalcino, but that would get me in a lot of trouble with people. Better we have to edit that bit out. But no, it's '08 is definitely a charming vintage, but for me it doesn't quite express the full ferrous sanguine richness that one expects from Sangiovese Grosso. So '07 fabulous vintage, and I Nathan said I think we've got a few bottles left of this, and we are getting in. Managed to for those of you who were with us last week, Filippo was banging on about the '07 vintage from Romitorio, and we've got I think 36 magnums each of the Brunello and the Reserva '07 that he's going to give us, which is great news. So plenty of '07s for us to enjoy. Now we shall move on, not very far, in fact, about 50 meters, 40, 50 meters to the Madonna del Piano Riserva '03. So this is Valdicava's top wine, their single vineyard. It's the, you can't see, of course, you have the bottle in front of you, but the picture on the front of the estate bottling is the cherub. Is it a cherub? Oh dear. Anyway, yes, it's a cherub. It's the cherub which appears in the Chiesa Madonna del Piano, which is the tiny little church which the vineyard of the eponymous name surrounds, and the cherub appears on a fresco in that church. And this is one of the greats, one of the truly great Brunellos. It was, again, looking at ratings and critical appreciation, in what was considered a very hot year. You'll probably recall, '03 '03 took everyone by surprise in the wine world, not just in the wine world, frankly. Anyone living in a hot part of Europe in '03 was in for a hell of a summer. Even in the UK, my God, I mean, 2003 was the best English wine vintage until 2018, because we had the first decent summer in years. Anyway, '03, a torrid vintage, very, very hot. Certainly, Bordeaux's from '03, Burgundy's from '03 really carry the not just the trace, the imprint of this year. I think Montalcino carries the heat better, although it was certainly very, very warm indeed. And some of the wines can lack a bit of structure, be a bit soupy. What I like about Valdicava always is, despite this kind of Pruneau character, despite the richness, despite the power, there is still a freshness there. You'll note, I hope, again, if not florality, but some dried flower character, some dried violets. There is definitely a trace of youth still clinging on in this now quite evolved and hot year. Amber, sorry, I'm conscious there's been quite a bit of chat going on, and I've been charging on, so I haven't really dealt with all your questions, but I just saw that one pop in about the oak treatment, Valdicava. It does use some new oak and also some barriques, but again, it's dominated by larger tonneaux rather than barriques. So some new in there, but the key thing is it's sort of 500 liters rather than 250. One of the other things I think it's important to point out is I know I do, obsess a little bit about oak and new oak. One of the things with Brunello, of course, is the length of time it spends in the oak. If you're spending potentially 4.5 years plus in oak, then you need to make damn sure it's the right type of oak, or rather it's not the wrong type. So 100% new oaked Brunellos are I'd like to say increasingly rare. Peter's comment: view of the '09 vintage. Personally, I think it's a great vintage, and I think it's a very classic vintage. It's interesting because it's sandwiched in between '08, which is a much lighter vintage, and 10, which up until 16, and even according to some critics on a par with 16, is the greatest Brunello vintage since 2001. So 9, excuse me, slightly under the radar, but when you talk to producers, they love their '09s. They really love their '09 vintage because they think it's it's classic, but not classic in the way we say when we're trying to sell rubbish vintage Bordeaux. Classic as in it does everything a good Brunello should. It's that there is, when you try the '09s alongside the 10s, they're slightly they're maybe a touch more rustic. They're slightly looser knit. Um, uh, I, I would say they don't have quite the same intensity, but they have and I wouldn't say they were charming wines necessarily, but they have an authenticity about them, where you really know you're drinking a good Brunello. They've got that real benchmark, kind of like you've just kind of cut your lip on a bloody knife, that sort of blood and ichor, rust and blood, basically. So they're very, very attractive wines indeed. I think the '09 vintage is going to be a delightful one to tackle from most producers in the next probably 2 to 3 years. Good. So gosh, look at that, and 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to just go back and look at the chat here, because there's been quite a few comments and questions, and I know I won't have dealt with many of them. So I'm going to work backwards. Apologies if your question was towards the start. From Richard: Greater City on 2 Valdicavas. Anything to do specific site to site or early picking? They are following some biodynamic principles. They definitely don't pick late, and it's it's dare I say it, minimal intervention winemaking as well. So you're getting incredible freshness and energy, this vivacity that comes through every time. Question here. Why have we selected? Oh, sorry, that's from Nathan to me. Well, I'll answer it anyway. Yes, fair enough. There are lots of great Brunello producers out there, and why have we focused this year on these 5? Well, actually, normally we kind of focus in on maybe 3. I think that Valdicava tends to come up trumps every year. Romitorio and Mastrojanni, we often, one or the other, and Argiano, because it's such good value. This year with 16, it's such a good vintage, it's time to push the boat out. And in fact, it's not just these 5, though. We are going to do another Brunello offer tomorrow on a couple more producers who we couldn't crowbar in this evening, because we just think, 16 is a proper back up the trucks vintage. However, these particular producers we've chosen this evening, the simple answer is we really like them. They're all very individual. They've all got their own style. They're wonderful people to work with. I think they're all, in their different ways, great expressions of their individual terroirs, whilst being great ambassadors for Montalcino as a region. What makes a great Brunello year? Ooh, what's driving this? I think it's a hot region. First of all, Montalcino is hot. We're in southern Tuscany, so you rarely get problems with ripeness, unless, of course, you get a cool, autumn comes early. You get a cool burst at harvest time, or of course you get rains. Rains either early on causing mildew and rot, or just before the harvest, which will dilute things. I think that Montalcino really benefits from balance, and rains, a good amount of rainfall in the early part of the year. So, you know, the winter, I think you need a good wellspring or ground reserves rather of water to sustain the grapes in what will inevitably be, especially now with you know, climate change, warmer and warmer years. So the simple answer is you need not too much heat and enough water. And then where you get that balance right, and the better you get that balance, is where you get the difference between a 5-star vintage and a 4-star vintage. And I'm glad to say that the majority of vintages in Brunello have been 5 or 4-star in the last sort of 20 years, with a few notable exceptions. Just working my way back. Gosh, where did we go? There was something there. A comment from Richard about the fig and raisin on the 07, age or a warm vintage, combination of the two. The 07 is definitely, of the 6 wines, it was the first one that we've come to where you were showing proper secondary evolution, you know, so definitely the fresher fruit that you find in the 15, 16s and 13s has evolved into the more compote style of fruit, the more kind of, you know, fruit bowl you've left and come back from holiday after 2 weeks, and definitely everything's getting a little bit more kind of bedded in and richer and sweeter. Who else? What have we got here? Done the 09. Oh, actually, one thing I should point out, which may be of interest to some, is one of the other wines that we're just released or about to just release is our first kosher Brunello, Brunello 16, great vintage to launch a project. And this is from a producer called Tassi. And what's really interesting is that it's got amazing scores and reviews, you know, 94s and 5s and 6s, but the kosher production of the Brunello has been rated higher than exactly the same cuvee, which has not been supervised by a rabbi, a rabbinical winemaker. So for those of you who aren't aware, Nathan and I have been slowly but surely building up a portfolio of really interesting kosher fine wines, starting in Bordeaux, now Burgundy. And yeah, we are very pleased to be adding this one to the portfolio, something a bit new and exciting for our observant Jewish friends. Mark, were you raising a hand there? Or were you, Mark, Dan? No, I thought you were raising a hand. You were just waving, so I thought you were going to say something. Okay. Okay. Well, look, we've come to our full hour, run over by a minute. Again, I've charged through this. Lots more I could say. For those of you who need to disappear off, then thank you very much for joining. If this was your first time with us, then please do come back for more. We've got some wonderful events coming up. We will be sort of moving focus to Bordeaux fairly soon in the run-up to the launch of the 2020 En Primeur campaign. We've got some pretty amazing events coming up on that front, including on the 23rd, a truly remarkable vertical of Smith Haute Lafitte with commercial director of the estate. And then after that, on the 24th, if I could encourage you to put one date in your diary, then you must come and join us for our evening, which is an annual affair and has been for as long as I've known him, at least 15 years, with Anselmo Guerrieri Gonzaga from Tenuta San Leonardo, the Sassicaia of the North from Trentino on the 24th. So please join us for that. Thanks very much, as I said, everyone, for joining. Those who'd like to stay on for a bit, please do. I'm going to have a drink myself and happy to take more questions or hear your comments or your thoughts. And yeah, brilliant. Cheers. Oh, lovely to see you all. Oh, that's good. Now let's just have a little look. Were there other bits and other questions there that I ducked or jumped over? Well, thank you, Laura and Chris. Definitely attending some more. Well, that's always good to hear. Always.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear back from our newcomers to see if how they managed to stay awake with your fantastic chat, Tom.
Amazing. Yeah. I
It
mean,
was interesting, Tom. It was interesting to see the
I
comment.
kept sticking myself with a pin, so yeah.
Tom, it was interesting to see the comment from Gareth earlier saying, my takeaway for tonight is that Brunello is more risky than I thought versus Barolo. Probably nonsense, but I'd feel safer ordering a 16 Barolo off a list than a Brunello. Gareth, I find that quite surprising because I came away from it feeling the other way around.
Gareth, are you still there to defend yourself? Where's he gone?
I don't know about defend yourself. It's an interesting comment.
Well, Nathan, you hit me at wine 6 of the tasting when I can ill defend myself, but that
was the whole idea, Gareth. I never play fair.
No, it's I don't know. Brunello's. I mean, yeah. My takeaway from the evening would be that the variety on show this evening, to me, would make me concerned. Without your sort of knowledge of the producers and the descriptions you gave, it feels a wine that you could only really order with authority.
I think, Gareth, one of the things I went on a consortio tour of Montalcino. When was it, Tom? About 4 years ago. And so, of the nearly, over 220 producers now, I spent a lot of time going around. It must have been about 30, and we then did flights of tastings from so many others. And the thing that Tom has really focused on, and that's why I was sort of sotto voce asking the question to Tom, why have we focused on these 3 to 5 producers each year, is because they're consistent. They're different stylistically. They've all got strong sustainability credentials, and give them 7 years and they produce brilliant wines. On the downside, look for the gaps. For example, 2014s, we didn't offer anything. Even though one of those producers offered us wine, we turned them all down, I think, Tom. We just focused on the reserves last year, 2 years ago. And then Mastrojanni would be a good example where we felt that they went through a bit of a down period. 10 and 11 were brilliant. 12, 13, we weren't so hot on, and we returned to them with 15 again.
Yeah, interesting. I think, Gareth, with regard to the Brunello Barolo comparison, all I would say is both are far too young to drink in a restaurant now, but and it's not to say that you won't have your preferences from producer to producer, but the quality of the vintage in both region, in Barolo and Montalcino, is hard to think of a better vintage. There are some which might rival it, but it's hard to think of a better one. Peter Dean, who I think has now left us. Lovely to see Peter. Oh no, Peter, you're still there. Good. I was about to say something really unpleasant, but okay, good. I was going to say, I was just going to point to your comment saying your first Brunello vintage was 97. Now, 97 was also my first Brunello vintage, and it's still lauded as not yet bettered. 01 was the next 97. I think 99 is terribly good, and after 01, 04 and 06 came close, and then it was 10, and then it was 16. So if you're looking at the champion vintages from Montalcino, then 16, possibly in brackets 15, 16 in brackets 15, 10 in brackets 6 and 4, 01, 99 in brackets and 97. That would be your absolute go-to list. Not many of the 97s estate level wines are kind of, they've all reached their apogee, and they're probably just tacking along and ever so slightly fading. But some of the 97 reservers, particularly from the big boy producers, Biondi Santis, etc., have years left. So I mean, it's a great vintage. Absolutely. Any more comments or questions? Mark, you are raising your hand this time. Mark, good, right.
Thank you. I mean, it was delicious and lots of fun. And I wonder, I was going to ask a question, because a lot of you all seem to have done the tours and got around to the vineyards and the consortios. And possibly because of the acidity that kept coming around, no matter the age, and probably because of the time of day, I couldn't help but get a hankering for some food with this wine. It was like I wanted to have a rich ragout with it. I thought they would play together beautifully, and because that, I mean, really, particularly the last two. But I was wondering, when you go to the consortiums, when you go there, what do they do? What do they ply you with to offset, to bring the best out of the wine?
You know, it's a good one. I mean, when I'm trying at the estates, it's normally barrel samples. So the wines have a degree of primary fruit, which makes them, that makes them really quite attractive. When you're having bottles in the winery, you might get a little lump of pecorino and some breadsticks just to kind of keep the saliva going, keep the plaque on your teeth. But otherwise, you're right, Mark. It would be lovely to turn up to do a tasting and have a bistecca alla fiorentina with the mushrooms on top and the spinach and cream, and or a great sort of a ragu cinghiale. Would be magnificent. But that's what you have afterwards in the restaurants. I do remember, I'd say I'm a pretty, I've got a pretty adventurous palate, but the most challenging thing I ever ate coincided with the fastest I've ever consumed an entire bottle of Brunello, which was, there's a Florentine speciality when I lived there. Well, it's always been a speciality, not just when I lived there, called Lampredotto, which is a veal calf's lower intestine, which is sort of boiled in a vinegary broth and served like that. And it looks like the sort of thing that you see in low budget Dickens adaptations, which they feed the kind of the orphans. I mean, it's just utterly, and it tastes vile. It's utterly vile. And that I think I polished off a good bottle of 99 Brunello very rapidly just to get it down me, frankly. But yeah, a good Brunello is perfect with rich cuisine, rich Tuscan cuisine for sure.
Tom, it's the perfect vineyard tasting when the grandmother comes along and says, "You're looking as though you've tasted lots of our wines. Now I need to feed you."
Yeah, definitely. Excellent. John waving. Good. Please unmute yourself, or are you waving goodbye? I can't quite tell. I think it's a question. John, you're still on mute. Sorry.
No. I put a question a little bit earlier. From what you were saying earlier about the thicker skins and some of the resilience associated with the grape, is this the sort of grape that would be more suited to a warmer planet that we're all beginning to live with? Is it going to be sustainable longer than some of the other grapes which we now take for granted?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I'd say there's sort of a two-part answer, if you will. I think firstly, Tuscany is hot and has been hot for a long time. So the viticulture which has grown up in this climate is better attuned to the hot weather than we are seeing in traditionally cooler climate regions. So I think Champagne and Burgundy are going to find it a lot tougher if the climate continues rising as it is, simply because they're just not used to the weather that they're currently getting. Montalcino has always been hot. It might be getting a little bit hotter now, but the grapes, the winemakers, the vineyards are more attuned and more adaptable to the hotter weather. So I do think it's not going to benefit Montalcino, the weather, that's for sure, but it will be less disadvantaged than other regions.
I guess it's partly the place, and it's also the grape. So is it possible to take the grape a little bit further north?
It is, although perhaps another opportunity, another option is when you look at Montalcino, look at a map, you'll see there are, it's not everything, it's not like it's not sort of like Burgundy where you've got lots of lovely kind of south-facing slopes by and large around the Côte d'Or, and then other bits kind of poking out here and there. There's so many different expositions and elevations in Montalcino that, there are some great Brunellos from 2014, which were from sites which normally are very, very high up and get too much sun, and they work very well. Similarly, there are some really good vintages of Brunello from the very, very hot vintages from those vineyards which are much shadier and cooler. So I think possibly what you'll see with Sangiovese Grosso is more planting within the region, but on those sites which are higher and therefore cooler at night, and possibly not as south-facing, that are slightly shadier, more east and west-facing. As for taking the grape further north, I mean, remember, Sangiovese is the most widely planted grape in central Italy. So it's everywhere. This particular clone, maybe we'll see it moving up north into the hills of Chianti. I don't think we'll see it heading south necessarily, but yeah, it'll be an interesting one to follow for sure.